their exponentially superior computing power, robust against noise, which is the major problem preventing large-scale quantum computers from existing today. I am contracted, by the way, to write a book on artificial brains by the end of 2009 and another on TQC by the end of 2010. Well, I never got round to writing those two books because I switched careers. I became an ARCer, after retirement career, being a Globicator, global educator, teaching PhD level students around the world for free in pure math and math physics by making YouTube lecture course videos and electronic libraries, e-libraries, by putting up tens of thousands of links to full content books, the links provided by Google, so thanks to Google. So thus revolutionizing education, making it free at PhD level in those subjects. Back to the book. Within a few months, the ABL's budget had doubled, thanks to the ambitions of my young dean. A few months after that, the government of the province made the lab a provincial key lab, with a further 4 million RMB, taking the total to 10 million RMB. I have thus plenty of money to build a brain. The Chinese government, both at province level and federal level, is very keen to develop high-tech research and is prepared to put big money into it. Believe me, ask any Western research professor just how attractive such a deal would be, that is to be given a 10 million RMB budget and complete freedom to teach what one likes. It's undeniably attractive. Such circumstances are the great attraction of China for me and are the main reasons for keeping me in China. My American friends and colleagues had been looking closely at what has been happening to me in China and had been amazed. Not surprisingly, a growing number of them have decided to do the same, that is, to migrate from the US to China, at least part-time at first, and for some full-time. For example, ad-libbing my good friend, close friend, Ben Gersel, who's famous father of AGI, Artificial General Intelligence. Thus, one is beginning to see the early signs of a reverse brain drain. Traditionally, one has seen the most capable Chinese university students move to the US or Europe to do their PhDs, and many of them choose never to return to China, to its grossly inferior salaries and its social/political backwardness. But as anyone can predict, if China continues to grow economically at a rate greatly superior to that of the US, and with its 4 times larger population, it's only a question of time before China becomes the new #1 this century, that is, the China Rising phenomenon. I am very conscious of this reasoning, and being a very forward-thinking, future-oriented person, I tell myself that I'm in the right place, the right country, but I do ask myself frequently, am I here too soon? Ad-libbing now. Answer, yes, too soon. So I will live out my last decades, I guess, in the West. If China ad-libbing still, if China democratizes, say, in 5 to 10 years, then I might come back for the above reasons. Maybe. On the downside is the sheer lack of development of China. I see it in the faces of the peasants, in their hundreds of millions, namely the dirty, unwashed, ignorant, brutal poverty that dominates their daily lives. International statistics show that the Chinese have an average annual income of about $3,000 per year per person in exchange rate terms, which is about 20 times smaller than that of the richest countries, situated mostly in Europe and the US. The brute reality is that China is a poor country, what I call a bottom third, low status nation, as I use in an earlier paragraph in this section. I am not PC, that is politically correct. I prefer negative truths to diplomatic lies. I've lived in too many countries to be interested in protecting national egos. I much prefer stating what I see as the truth, even if it hurts the self-images of monos. In China's case, I see a people who have a long way to go to catch up with the West in terms of education, democracy, lifestyles, sex roles, sex education, international travel, internet access, living standards, self-fulfillment, political assertion, etc. In many ways, I feel degraded living in China. I feel that it's a culture unworthy of me to be living in. I've lived in the best, most developed cultures on the planet, including the US, Europe and Japan. So with such a basis for comparison, living in China's third world backwardness is frustrating. I survived largely by isolating myself in an ivory tower, living a life of the mind, surrounded by my 12,500 paper books in my private library and more than 30,000 electronic books and papers. It's now over 50,000 electronic books and papers I've pretty well converted everything to electronic form now. Paper for me is a relic. Absorbing such knowledge can be done anywhere on the planet as long as one has access to broadband internet. Thus the frustrations of daily life in China are minimized so they can survive in reasonable mental health with not too much psychological stress and frustration at China's daily inferiorities. After 2.5 years, how have my views on China and the Chinese changed compared to what I wrote earlier in the previous paragraphs? My views are largely the same, except perhaps I would emphasize more the intellectual slothfulness of the Chinese mentality. The Americans have an expression: when the going gets tough, the tough, that is minded people, get going. Whereas in China, I notice there seems to be more of an attitude of minimizing intellectual effort or mental laziness. I notice it with my students and even with my Chinese wife. The Chinese definitely do not have the Japanese gambare, that is, persistence. I suspect that there's a correlation between the level of tough-minded discipline of the people and their standard of living. Look at the Germans, the Japanese and the Americans on the one hand, and the black Africans and the Arabs on the other. In the latter case, both groups have a bad international reputation of having no can-do attitudes towards performing difficult tasks. This attitude does not generate respect from first-worlders. The Chinese are not much better on the whole. I can understand a reluctance to persist at a task if that task has been imposed on someone by a dictatorial source. For example, my dean simply ordered various junior professors to work in my lab, independently of whether they were interested in the topic or not. This shocked me, not surprisingly. Those who were not interested and who had other agendas were not motivated to work hard at the job at hand. Under Mao, most tasks were imposed. There was very little freedom of choice of jobs. After 30 years of this under Mao, I can understand the Chinese attitude of doing as little as possible so not to attract negative attention. It's a rational strategy under Maoist-type dictatorship, but is a mentality that's quite unworthy of survival in a modern democracy that China is yet to become. I see China's biggest problem as its government. It is keeping China backward. It stops its citizens from absorbing the television of its neighbours. For example, to get access to the BBC World and CNN television channels, I had to employ a Chinese company to install an illegal satellite dish that was quasi-hidden at the top of my apartment building. Once the present CCP, Chinese Communist Party, is replaced by a democratic government, then the Chinese people can be exposed far more readily to the growing world community with its global mentality that this book is mostly about. The Chinese people will be given the television of many of their neighbouring countries. Most Chinese have no idea how backward China is compared to most of the world, except perhaps for a superficial idea of how much richer Americans are than Chinese, judging by the standard of living shown in American movies. Most Chinese I talk to know almost nothing about the atrocities committed against the Chinese people by Mao, by the CCP, nor that 2/3 of countries on the planet are already democracies, nor that the CCP is deliberately keeping the Chinese people ignorant so that it can stay in power a few years more before it is inevitably kicked out by the rising Chinese middle class, now estimated to number between 100 to 200 million people. Well, now I think it's around 300 million or so, as has already happened in roughly 100 countries over the past half-century. There's a mean-spiritedness in the Chinese mentality that I find terribly unattractive. My Chinese wife says that before Mao's Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, the Chinese were a much more generous, kinder people, but considering the suspicion fostered in Mao's China, where children were encouraged to spy on their parents, neighbour on neighbour, etc., in a brutal authoritarian state, mutual trust was the victim. China now has more internet users than the US, so the rising younger Chinese, especially the university-educated Chinese, know that their own government is censoring them, denying them freedom of speech. Most educated young Chinese would prefer to live in a democracy and feel cynical about their own government. They only tolerate it because at least it has given them the world's best economic growth rates over a period of 30 years, since the Deng Xiaoping reforms of the late 1970s. It may be interesting to speculate that the US-created world recession may have an interesting side effect, namely the downfall of the CCP, and hence the democratization of 20% of the world's population, which would be a significant and historical event when it eventually happens. Many Chinese political economists claim that China needs a minimum GNP economic growth rate of about 8% per year to be able to absorb the huge influx of peasants coming from Western China, seeking a superior economic standard of living in the eastern cities. With the recession in the Western countries, China's economic growth rate has nosedived, and its export industries have been hit hard by the downturn in export orders from the Western countries. This has resulted in massive layoffs due to company bankruptcies and hence greater resentment against the CCP. One of the colleagues in my lab, a young postdoc, says that the general feeling in China is that the CCP is tolerated by most Chinese people, even though it is not elected, so long as it continues to deliver high economic growth rates. If that growth rate disappears and people lose their jobs, general frustration against the government will rise. There are already thousands of isolated political protests against the government each year, and the number is growing. Last I heard it was about 200,000 violent demonstrations, political demonstrations, per year in China. 200,000. These protests usually reflect the lack of development of legal institutions in China. The peasants have little redress against corrupt local CCP politicians who exploit them, making the peasants angry and bitter. My prediction in earlier sections that China will make the transition to democracy in about 10 to 15 years from the time of writing, that is around the year 2020, that's the transition, may be accelerated by the surprise recession in the US and because of the economic dominance still of the US economy. The rest of the trading world, this transition may even occur within 5 years, depending on how low China's economic growth rate falls. Well, that did not happen. The official Chinese growth rate is still around, 7%, which isn't too bad, if you can believe it. The transition will probably occur first in the eastern Chinese cities, which already have a sizable middle class. Once a critical mass of educated middle-class Chinese start to feel that the CCP is no longer useful, that is, no longer delivering the economic goods, then its inherent inferiorities, that is, its lack of legitimacy, that is, its not being chosen, not being elected by the Chinese people, will become a major source of resentment and frustration. Any monopoly institution, whether commercial or governmental, is prone to inefficiency. When there is no competing institution to keep the first institution on its toes, motivation to provide efficient service to its clientele or its citizens tends to slide. In my own case, I noticed that the CCP bureaucracy of my university would often take several months to rubber stamp a form that would take an American university administration a week. It's maddening. That same university has rules that in practice have caused me to have no PhD students until after 18 months of the ABL project starting. Thus I have plenty of money, but too few full-time workers to do the real work. Thus, due to the inefficiencies of the university administration, the money is fine, but the personnel is not. What the left hand is giving, the right hand is taking away. But since ultimately it is the money that counts, I'll be able to bring in talented Westerners to do the work and have them paid by Chinese grants. That way China gets the credit. It's a pity, however, that my university's CCP-based administration is so inefficient. I'd like to see them booted out and be replaced by a system that has accountability, that is, elected, and if the elected administration does a poor job, then they can be voted out and replaced by alternative candidates who are willing to do a better job. I'd like to see the same principle applied to all levels of government, including at highest levels in Beijing. Recently, some Chinese academic and professional people signed a document called Charter 2008, which advocated China becoming a democracy. Within days, the Chinese police were harassing the signatories. In fact, one of them got the Nobel Peace Prize to a political move to piss off the Chinese Communist Party government. Such harassment disgusts me. It's such disgust that makes me feel that China is truly a shithole country. It deserves this terribly contemptuous title. CCP inefficiencies exist at every level and largely for the same reason, that is the lack of competition, and hence the possibility of corruption, as mentioned in an earlier section. With no free press, such corrupt practices go more easily undetected and unpunished. The local victims of such corruption and inefficiency are well aware of the injustice of such practices and treat the CCP with growing contempt. The initial civic-mindedness of the CCP in the pre-1949 days, when the CCP became the ruling party after a bitter civil war against Chiang Kai-shek, has long vanished. Mao promised the peasants democracy, but once he took power, he forgot all about it and became a modern emperor with murderous dictatorial powers, killing about 70 or 80 million Chinese, the greatest criminal dictator in history. Imagine then that the Western recession is long and that the CCP is unable to prevent the unemployment rate from increasing significantly. What is then likely to happen? Protests will break out at a greater rate and in many cities. Perhaps then the middle and intellectual classes, or a democratic faction within the CCP, may feel the time is ripe to launch a Chinese Democratic Party. With the internet, cell phones, etc., that's smart cell phones with the internet, it will be relatively easy to spread the word. Once one city makes a declaration of independence from the CCP, it's likely that many other cities will quickly follow. This is what happened in 1911, when the city of Guangzhou, under the influence of Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, declared independence from the Qing emperor, and quickly other cities followed. Once China is a democracy, I anticipate a flowering of Chinese creativity and the gradual disappearance of Chinese mean-spiritedness. Every time I cross the border from Hong Kong to the neighbouring Chinese city of Shenzhen, the richest city in China, I immediately feel a sharp lowering of the level of humanity between people. The Hong Kongers have freedom of speech and are a lot richer, having lived under British capitalism for a century and a half. This reflects in their behaviour towards each other. They are much more refined, gentle, considerate and humane. On walking a few hundred metres past the border, one is confronted by the mainland Chinese, who have lived under 30 years of Maoist dictatorship. The Chinese argue with each other, shouting at each other in a surly, mean-spirited way, definitely not humane. For a Westerner, it's difficult to live in such a culture. It's no wonder I tend to shut myself up in my ivory tower, taking advantage of the superior aspects of life in China as a research professor, but at the same time pouring scorn on China's many, many inferiorities. I really do feel that in many ways, as a Westerner, I'm living about a decade too soon in China. The culture is simply not developed enough yet to be considered worthy of a cosmopolitan Western intellectual to live in. How true. Well, that's the end of chapter 3, so I'll stop here, and the next chapter, chapter 4, is called Costs of the Nation-State System. In other words, what are the disadvantages of living in our current nation-state system compared with living in a global state, globa. Ciao.